what I'm going to be talking about today is this Signal Intelligence Alliance, which consists of the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These are all English-speaking countries, and this alliance was established at the end of the Second World War, in part in the view of Winston Churchill, as a way of ensuring that the English-speaking world can, bring order and safety to the rest of the world. It's a colonial imperial project almost, which has been expanded and morphed into this global information infrastructure. I've listed here the names of the agencies and the lead agencies in each of these countries, but there are many more in each country that have some connection. And in particular, as we've just seen, in the United States, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, and a number of other US agencies are closely linked in to this Signal Intelligence Alliance and have access to the data that is being collected on a worldwide basis. Oops. Sorry. I'm just having a little bit of trouble here. I don't know. I beg your pardon, but my slides are not changing the way that they should. So let me try this. All right. So sorry about that. I'll see if I can smooth this out in future. So what I'm going to take you on a sort of a journey into the depths of this global surveillance infrastructure, starting with a series of slides that were made public thanks to the brave whistleblowing of Edward Snowden, who in 2013 turned over a trove of secret documents to reporters, who then published it in various newspapers around the world. This slide is illustrative of a key perspective from the point of view of the National Security Agency, in that the US provides much of the world's telecommunications infrastructure, the backbone. And much of the data is routed through the United States on its way elsewhere. The diagram shows Canada and the US, Europe, Africa, Asia, Pacific, and Latin America. And the flows, and this is now 10 years old, but the flows are still very much often going through the United States. And with Europe, with the UK and Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, they have access to other parts of that network. And I have to remember, bear with me, to go to next slide. Okay, so the National Security Agency, which is the lead of course, of the Five Eyes Alliance, developed a policy of collect it all. This was their doctrine, certainly after 2001, after the attacks on September 11th. And this diagram here shows the two major ways in which the NSA and its allies collect information. The bottom one, PRISM program, is from the servers of major US service providers. That's how they get access to your emails, to your chat, and so on. And the other is what's known as upstream. And this is what I'm going to be concentrating on. And that's the collection of communication on the fiber optic cables and infrastructure as data flows past. And that's what I'm looking at. And this slide, I think, shows better than any other that I've encountered in the Snowden documents, the ways all the various ways in which the Five Eyes collects data. And we're going to pick this diagram apart and dig into it in some depth. Let's look first of all right at the top here. It says top secret ComInt, that's communications intelligence related to the US, AUS, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, and New Zealand. So this is a Five Eyes document, and it's shared amongst them. The next thing I want to look at are the various ways in which data is collected on this global infrastructure. And we're going to concentrate particularly here on the regional collection and large cable collection. And I want to show you just a bit about the way that Portugal and Spain, well, Portugal principally is implicated in this. It's a little hard to see, but blowing that up, you can see that there are many fiber optic cables actually that land directly in near Lisbon. So I've blown this section of the map up, and I count over a dozen fiber optic cables that land very close to where most of you are right now. That's of course for a whole series of political and historic and geographic regions. So these undersea cables are principal site for interception, either where they land on shore. So in Britain, much of the GCHQ, that's the UK's Signal Intelligence Agency, collects data right from those cables directly when they land. They also intercept it underwater near landing sites, possibly, I would suggest, near where you are, because there's such a heavy concentration. There's probably, the Lisbon area is one of the major points at which fiber optic cables come ashore or concentrated in a small area. So that's sort of a very high-level view of the infrastructure. I want to just provide a little bit of a historic note, because while it was shocking to the world in 2013 when Edward Snowden released this trove of documents, because it did provide for the first time sort of indisputable documentation of this vast surveillance infrastructure. This gentleman, James Bamford, had been writing about the National Security Agency for 30 years. And I just want to read this because it's telling about the long history and the scope and ambition. The National Security Agency is, quote, is free of legal restrictions while wielding technological capabilities for eavesdropping beyond imagination. Like an ever-widening sinkhole, NSA surveillance technology will continue to expand, quietly pulling in more and more communication and gradually eliminating more and more privacy. And I would add, as many have suggested, that we're not only losing privacy through this, but also democratic norms and institutions. That was in 1982, so that's now 40 years ago. Is that right? Yes. So it's been a while, and but it hasn't been publicly aware until recently, and this is what I'm partly trying to do, is to bring awareness to this vast surveillance infrastructure that we all rely on a pretty much daily basis, and where all of our electronic communications are in a position to be intercepted, analyzed, and acted upon, and without much oversight or say-so from us. So that's a sort of very broad picture, but I want to now sort of dig into the question of how do we know whether and where our own communication, um, internet communication, may be intercepted. It's all very well to say you've got a global infrastructure, but what does it mean in terms of individual communication? So let's have a look. And the key thing that for me, and I guess much of the other rest of the world who's interested in these surveillance operations, a key step or insight came in 2006 when a former AT&T, that's the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, one of the biggest in the world, a former employee blew the whistle on the company. And he worked at this building in San Francisco, downtown San Francisco, at 611 Folsom Street. And he reported, using publicly available documents that he had access to, that the National Security Agency had installed in this building splitter capabilities. That meant that the fiber optic cables, they had tapped into those, and they could make a copy of all of the data that was passing through that building. I'd like to show you a video that we produced through our Xmaps project, which is a research mapping project of internet traffic, that then gives you an idea of how this works. And I have to change screens here, so please bear with me for a sec. Okay, so this is a 3-minute video, but it gives you an idea.
Let's consider for a minute what the internet really is. You may have heard it described as a cloud, but it's not. Sure, it may seem like the internet's totally virtual and invisible, but really, it's physical. When you send or get something through the internet, your data passes through physical computers and cables to their destination. And your actions are anything but private. Researchers from the University of Toronto and OCAD University for the IFS Maps project have created this animation using Google Earth to show you how it all works. Let's say you're at the Ontario Science Centre in Toronto and you're really interested in art, and you decide to check out the website for a great place called the San Francisco Art Institute on the other side of the continent. Type in the website address, and away we go. Your data travels through cables to 151 Front Street. It may not look it, but this is one seriously important building. No 151 Front Street, no internet for you, Toronto. We bounce over to another building at 1 Yonge Street. Then it's off to another big hub in Chicago. Here's where things get interesting. Chicago is one of 20 cities where it's suspected that the US National Security Agency has set up an internet surveillance post. If the IFS Maps research team is right, your actions are getting scrutinized by a foreign intelligence service right here. And if not there, then for sure over here in San Francisco, where there's a confirmed NSA surveillance station in the major hub contained in this building. Only after this snooping do you proceed to your destination, with information coming back to you back in Toronto. What did you look at? Who now knows it? And what does that mean? Interesting questions. And there are others. Food for thought. And if you want to know more about the project Probing for Answers, use the internet to go here.
Okay, so that gives you a bit of an idea of some of the work that we've done in this project that tries to track where your data goes and identify where it passes through interception points. I want to be careful about the time here. It's 7 o'clock your time. So you're, how much more time would I have, Anna?
I would say 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly over some things, but I'd be very glad to come back in questions to go into more detail if you would like that. So let's go back to our slides. So I just want to show you how we've done the work that was used to produce that video in the Xmaps project. So I'll give you a quick tutorial, and I apologize on internet routing, and I apologize to those who are already familiar with this. But let's take the example of going to a web page from whatever device you have to the San Francisco Art Institute. So this is a page on their site. 10 famous artists you didn't know that went to SFAI. So this is a pitch on their behalf to recruit students. Some of you may want to go there. So the first of all, it's important to understand that every device on the internet has what's known as an IP address, an internet protocol address. So in the case that we've just looked at the video of, it started at a device whose IP address is this number, 206.248.154.0. So IP addresses, at least most of them, are of this form, 4 sets of three digits. The web server in San Francisco, owned by the San Francisco Art Institute, which is known on the internet as sfai.edu, also has an IP address, and that in this case is 63.197, etc. So when you access that website, your request will be something like get sfai.edu, 10 famous artists who went to SFAI, and that gets broken down into a series of data packets. Packets consist of two parts. There's a header, which consists largely of the IP address of where that packet is to be sent and where it has come from. And then there's the content, and that content, whether it's something you're, in this case, it's a request for a page, or the image that's returned, or your video or audio or anything, is going to be in the payload of these packets. Now, each packet is handed from one router to another in hops that go across the country or around the world. And in each case, the router looks at the to address and forwards it on to what it figures is the most suitable router. And each of those have IP addresses. There's software called Traceroute that our project Xmaps has modified that records each router hop and the round trip time between from the origin to that particular router. And this is what is produced in the raw Traceroute program. a series of IP addresses you can see there, and round trip time starting from with 0 milliseconds or less than 1 millisecond, and up to 79 when it gets to Art Institute. What we do then is add some additional information. We try to assign a latitude and a longitude to each of those IP addresses because they're representing routers, and they're physical large machines in the big buildings at the center of cities usually. And then also the name, the host name, which looks like what you see on the right there. So what we do is look at this and try to figure out where it has passed through an interception point. In this case, we're just looking at the names. We see SFFCA as part of the name for the AT&T one. So we put all of those routers, locate them in 611 Folsom Street. Bingo. This is an easy case, but this is how we identify that your data passed through that site. And we now do this for thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of trace routes, and you can generate trace routes yourself to see where your own data goes, and see whether it passes through an NSA site or through a GCHQ site, or at least the countries that it passes through or the cities it passes through. And in this case, when we map that, this is the route we get. It's a bit, well, you saw this earlier, but that's what our Xmaps produces in a way of a map. The other thing that we've looked at, and it was a bit of an astonishing thing for me, was from my office at the University of Toronto, accessing the Ontario Student Assistance Program. These are student loans that's across the street, actually. You can almost see the building where this server is, but the data went through New York and Chicago and back to Toronto before it reached the actual OSEP offices. And at each of New York and Chicago, it's generally understood that there are NSA interception sites like the one at 611 Folsom Street and like the ones that they have installed in other places around the world, according to that map that I showed you earlier of the global infrastructure. We call this a boomerang route because you throw it out and it comes back. And this is of concern for us as Canadians, because a large fraction of our domestic traffic goes through the United States, where it is subject to NSA interception, and we have no legal protection from that, no constitutional protections, and also it has some. It's also inefficient in many ways. So there's a myth that the internet routes things efficiently. It doesn't always do that. In fact, what matters most is which carriers or which ISPs or internet service providers, which telecom companies connect with which other ones. And for a variety of business reasons, they connect in some unusual and strange ways. And this is in part what we're trying to show, is how the internet is put together in terms of who's connecting to whom and where that routing goes. This also has some implications for a country like yours, like Portugal. So in our database, there aren't that many routes that start in Portugal, but I selected a few just to illustrate some of the strangeness and also the risks associated with it. So here's a route that was generated from Madeira. Actually, I had the good fortune to visit Madeira in 2015, and using Xmaps, developed a trace route from where I was there to the Autonomous University of Madrid in Spain. And this is the route that the data took. it did go to Lisbon, as you might expect, but then before going to Madrid, it went via the UK and a couple of other European countries. And in the UK, it's almost certainly intercepted by GCHQ. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're particularly interested in the traffic that these particular examples of going to the Art Institute or going to OSAP in Toronto or the university in Spain, but it illustrates their capacity. And no, if I was a political dissident and I disagree with my government on quite a number of things, if it was taken seriously, then they would pay more attention to my traffic, even if I'm doing it perfectly legally. Now, this is not an inevitable routing. So, for instance, here is the routing from someone who I don't know, who is in Aveiro, if that's how you pronounce it, near Porto, who used the Xmaps to generate a trace route to that university. And this time it goes to Porto, Lisbon, and then directly to Spain. And that's because it uses different carriers who have different interconnection policies. So it's possible to keep data much more local if the carriers, the ISPs, so wish. Here's another example, which is a bit odd, but it illustrates an important principle. Again, from Madeira, accessing the website of Diario de Noticias, probably mangled the pronunciation, but that's a Madeiran newspaper. But it's actually hosted, its website is hosted in London, UK. So accessing that site, oddly, you might think, but maybe there are good business reasons for it, because it's maybe cheaper to host it in one of these large companies. It is in London, and that data again is exposed to GCHQ. So, sorry, I'm going to skip over this. It's interesting about the way in which these interception points can be used to actually, well, they use implant is the word that they use here, implant spy software on other machines. And this is becoming increasingly important for these agencies as more and more data is encrypted and can't be read as easily. So instead, to get around that, they put their surveillance software on machines, and they can use their deep packet inspection and interception capabilities for doing this. Back in 2010, I think this was, they had done this on 50,000 implants. A decade later, I'm sure this number is much, much larger. But this is how it works. I'm not going to go into it just because I'm running out of time. So it detects it and then injects spyware, and it's done this on many, many occasions. So this leaves the question of what to do about this. And I want to leave you with a few thoughts. They're preliminary, and you sort of have to make it up as you, according to your own sort of needs and interests. But I'd say a principal approach is one of self-defense, both individually, what can you do yourself, but also collectively. Individuals are not going to be able to do much to protect themselves if they're acting alone. There needs to be sort of policy and political changes. But I'll just run quickly through some of the things that you might interest you. So one of them is educate yourself. And an easy way to start is there's several movies, films that are made about this. I'd say most notably is the documentary Citizen 4 by Laura Poitras, who was one of the journalists who got the that Snowden contacted with their documents. It won the Academy Award for documentary in 2015, so that's an easy one to go in, a very interesting, I find quite exciting documentary. Mentioned the Snowden Archive, as did Anna. You can look up these documents, these still secret documents technically, on the Surveillance Archive. Unfortunately, right now our SSL certificate has expired, so some of you may find that your browser is protecting you against that, and we need to fix that. It's not. I don't run this site anymore, so I have to apologize in advance, but we will try and get that back going for those who are using the more secure browsers. Another is to look at the ways in which international human rights groups have developed a set of principles that they call the necessary and proportionate principles for the application of human rights to communication surveillance. So this is a group of over 600 organizations, and it's been signed by over 250,000 individuals. This was some time ago. And the general statement here is that surveillance has a role to play in our world, but it needs to be brought within a regime of democratic governance and international human rights, and they have proposals for how to do this. I think this is a very important initiative. Here are some of the principles. Obviously, it needs to be backed up by law and treaty, but we're not suggesting throwing out all forms of surveillance, but we need to bring it under better control. There's a number of technical steps you can take. Encryption is clearly one of them, although they're increasingly breaking encryption. And as I mentioned a moment ago, there are ways that they get around encryption by installing spyware on individual devices. You can also use browsers that obscure your traffic by having it hop around all over the world before it reaches its destination, so that it can't be traced back to you. And more generally, Portugal being in the EU and covered by the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, that does provide some protection, and it's something that is the best in the world, I'd say, in terms of drawing attention to and protecting against the Five Eyes surveillance. But there are limits to that, and it needs to be strengthened. And also, to the extent that you can, try to avoid having your data hosted or routed through Five Eyes countries and through their routers. We're working, our Xmaps project now is working on a project with the Internet Registration Authority in Canada to map and understand our traffic better, and our internet infrastructure and its vulnerabilities in various ways, and that would be another thing that would help countries to avoid these sorts of problems. Here's a list of readings that you might find interesting, and then finally a pitch for the IFS Maps project, so that if you'd like to see where data goes, particularly your own data, try it out and contribute your data data to our database, and that will help us, and you might get some insight into that. So those are my remarks. Thank you for your attention, and I'd really welcome any questions you might have.
you, Andrew. Can you move back one slide for the reading list? Oh, no,
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to take a picture. I often give stuff for students to read.
Oh, okay. Well, I can do that. You want to take a picture? And I'd be glad to. Oh, that's yes.
It's done.
I'll be
So-
glad to send my slides to anybody who wants it, and my email address was on the beginning of that. Okay.
So we will open up for questions, and I have a bunch of questions. Let me see which one I'll start with, and then I'll give the floor to someone else. Okay, so my question is, I teach a cyber cultures class, and I teach my students about how the internet was created to be decentralized because of a nuclear attack. You know, it's supposed to be fault resistant, etc. And it isn't anymore.
Oh, not anymore.
No. So what happened? Do you?
What happened? Right. Well, I think there's two things. One was that the idea of that it's decentralized and can withstand a nuclear attack. It was designed so that you could, you know, it's a rather horrifying prospect, but you know that a bomb that landed on any city that destroyed the internet in that area would not take the rest of it down. And so that, you know, that was an important guiding principle, but that's not the only thing that goes into the development and operation of the internet. What's happened since then, of course, and that was back in the 60s and the 70s when they started working on that, and it's a very important design principle. But particularly as the internet became part of essential, I would say, critical infrastructure for all kinds of purposes, then a lot of large actors became involved in its creation and maintenance, and they have their own interests. Academics, libertarians like the idea of a highly decentralized and open network, and I think it's an important principle. But look at AT&T. You know, it had a strong interest in maintaining control over its portion of the internet. The internet, in its name, is the internet is a network of networks, and each of those individual networks that are pieced together by business arrangements is all private, or at least largely in North America. In other countries, there's some, you know, public ownership, but these are largely private companies. The global internet carriers are all private. They have their own business interests, and they want to keep as much of the traffic and control as they can. So they have then established you know, well, some forms of centralized control. The other thing is just physically, you know, fiber optic cable is always somewhere, and those connections, to be done efficiently, need to be done in places where there are lots of other fiber optic cables. So we find that the switching centers are in a very few centers around the world, and a few dozen centers globally handle, I would say, over 90% of all of the traffic in the world. So it's highly centralized in that way. And so from the point of view of a surveillance agency, if you want to get the data, you know, like you go where the money is, you go where the data is, and the data is in these centers, and that's what they've done. The NSA has done with AT&T. They went to AT&T and say, we want to put in our splitter interception devices, and with 20 of those approximately in North America, they can handle almost all of the traffic. So you have to look under the hood and see, who's doing what to whom. What are the interests? Where's the money going? What are the business interests? What are the, financial and political interests? And that has led considerably to the, I would say the erosion of that principle of decentralized control.
Okay.
I could go on, but I think I better stop.
Let me just say something. Everyone, you can type your questions, and then I'll read them aloud. So, but I wanted to ask one more thing, and then I'll stop. Which is, how much didn't we know before Edward Snowden actually released, that whole batch of? I mean, we knew obviously that there was, surveillance going on. I remember what the Echelon program. But
yeah.
Here I'm wondering, how much didn't we know before?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because as I mentioned, James Bamford was writing about this in 1982 and had been following it ever since. So Bamford was not surprised. Right? But he didn't have the actual documents in the way that Snowden released. So Snowden confirmed it with documents, authentic documents, many of the things that those who were sort of in the know suspected. And Mark Klein was another one who in 2006, I mean, that was where, my introduction to that. So people who were in this field knew much of the sort of the outlines of the form of total surveillance that was being conducted, but it wasn't newsworthy. I mean, there might have been a news story. Well, there was a couple of news stories, here and there, but it wasn't generally understood, and so it didn't have much political traction. It still doesn't have a lot of political traction, frankly. I'm disappointed. There are very little changes, at least legislatively, that have occurred since Snowden, because there are so many vested interests in keeping it the way it is. But I think what's surprising is the depth and the scale. It's breathtaking as to how far how far these agencies were able to go worldwide and in a very fine-grained way. So we didn't know, for instance, that Angela Merkel's mobile phone was being tapped by the NSA, and she was really, really annoyed. So there were things that were surprising there. So what we know now, I would say, is the scope and the detail, the reach, the enormous appetite for data, and also its use in all kinds of ways other than national security.
Okay, so my student Francesca, who is actually Romanian, but I keep calling her Francesca as if she was Italian, asks, do you think that in the future surveillance will become a bigger issue? Or do you think that awareness that is being brought to this topic will actually diminish the range of surveillance?
I mean, thanks. That's an interesting question, and I sort of can't answer either way because I really don't know. In some ways, if the Snowden revelations do not lead to a curtailment of this surveillance, and I would say sort of illegal, unaccountable surveillance, it's hard for me to imagine what crisis or what scandal would top that in a way that would get the people who can make the changes, and also the public perception, get them so let's say, riled up, that they can actually force through changes. So in that sense, it's a bit depressing. And even further depressing is that once it was when Snowden's documents were first being published, it was scandalous. I mean, it was headline news around the world, and week after week there were more and more revelations, and there was a lot of agitation and discussion. But now we know that, and we sort of normalized it. It's, oh God, we know, but what can we do about it, right? So it's produced in a way a sense of helplessness that to get further would require an even bigger shock. On the other hand, I can tell myself that these things take a long time. The public perception, political change, and policy change take a long time to mobilize and gather strength so that they can have an effect. And I would say, and I don't know this well enough, but the GDPR, the European law, was in part provoked by the Snowden revelations, and that they have had some modest effects. So there's, I can go into more detail, but about affecting the flows of data between Europe and the US. Actually, a student, former law student, Max Schrems, was a critical actor in drawing European attention to this and reforming the law and the practices. So I think that there is a building sense, particularly around commercial surveillance, surveillance capitalism, I guess is the key term there, Shoshana Zuboff and a number of other people, where there's awareness that we're losing control over our own information. And as we understand that data and algorithms are vital mediators of our lives, there will be growing resistance and the development of alternatives. So it's going to take a while, and it's going to require effort. And that's what I'm hoping to contribute to. So I'm not pessimistic in the sense that I think it's hopeless, but I don't think it's going to happen quickly. It needs a lot of people in a concerted way to make those changes, big changes.
So a question that is being asked, which kind of is a segue into this, is Teresa Flores from FCSH. She's asking, do you have any explanation why many people knowing about this do not actually care and even grant information for free, kind of joyfully? And this is the great conundrum.
Yes, this is a very common one. I don't know people who offer it joyfully, to go that far, but yes, it's certainly, I think, very widespread that people express, I think, genuine concern about the loss of privacy and control over their data. But when presented with an offer for a discount, or that they want to look at something or watch something or access something that is of interest to them at the moment, and they're notified now, thanks to GDPR, it's kind of annoying, are you okay with cookies, right? And most of us, most of the time, will go along with that and allow our data to be collected. And I'm not sure how joyful, well, I'm not joyful about that, but I often provide that information. I often also go and look at, see what their settings are, but then I'm a researcher in this area, so I have another interest in it. So people are put into a very sort of asymmetric situation. The rewards of offering your information at any moment are relatively immediate. You get to get what you want. The the consequences or the negative consequences, the harms are distributed over time, and they're not immediate. Generally, they're sometime in the future. They're distributed across a lot of other people. So you might think that you're not going to be hurt, even if you understand that other people might be if they go along with this. And they're uncertain because these systems are so opaque. We don't know what people are doing, what these agencies are doing with it. For the most part, nothing, but we don't know when they will. So as a sort of a decision situation, it's a very asymmetric one. Immediate rewards versus long-term, possibly dire, and I would say cumulatively dire consequences for democracy. But we're human. We live our lives mostly day to day, moment to moment. So it appears as if people are being hypocritical. I think it's that the situations of data capture, and this is very deliberate, are structured in ways that get us to go along, even though we have misgivings. And so I think more people have misgivings about passing their information on, rather than being joyful that they think that everything's going to be just fine. But I don't know, but that's my guess.
So we have two questions about kind of democracy, and the first is by Adelina, and she asks, what is the relation between civil democratic society and the web surveillance architecture? Can a poor architecture managing system influence the quality of our democracy? So you talked a bit about this in the beginning, about this is dangerous also for democracy. Perhaps you can.
Yes. No. I mean, that is a big and again important question. I mean, is this something that democracy should worry about? And there's a lot of other things that democracies should be worrying about at this moment. I guess I'll answer in this way. The basic premise of a democracy is that the people ultimately are the ones who decide how they're going to run their society. Secret security agencies have an ambiguous role within democratic societies. On the one hand, to do their job, they need a degree of secrecy. They cannot be open about everything. Otherwise, they wouldn't be effective. And I think that's well understood. And I'm not arguing that either that we get rid of any form of intelligence agency, or that they just open their books and we know who they're looking at right now. So, but what we've seen in the case of the Five Eyes Alliance, and these countries are among the more democratic and responsive on Earth. I'm not saying that they're the most. Certainly, the United States isn't, and Canada has a number of flaws, on and on. But what we've seen these agencies do is to take the idea of secrecy far beyond what I think, and a lot of other people would say, or at least in this area think, is necessary for them functionally, but rather as an organization, they have adopted a view that anything that they reveal about their operation then provides an advantage to their opponent. And so, and this is common for any sort of security organization. Revealing what you're thinking, anything about what you're doing, makes it easier for others to attack. And that, I think, is, I will say toxic from a point of view of democratic governance, because then these agencies, use a colorful word here, go rogue. They will lie and cheat. And we have vivid examples. I got a slide. I didn't show it, this one, of the heads of the US National Security Agency, the NSA, and also the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, line to Congress when asked a direct question, do you survey, do you collect information on millions of Americans? They lie. And they then become what's being referred to as sort of as a form of deep state that operates according to its own internal logics that are out of the control of our legislatures and our governments more generally. And I don't think we can stand that. Another example is that the NSA, for its own interests, when it discovers or buys what are known as zero-day exploits, that there's a flaw in Microsoft's operating system that can be used to, rather than telling Microsoft, hey, you've got a problem, fix it, they collect them for their own exploits so that they can interfere with other computers. So this approach arguably weakens the security of our critical infrastructure for the internal reasons, for the internal motives of the security agencies. So I think in many ways they are acting against the collective interest, even though they are nominally there to protect that. So that's sort of why I think it's there's a problem for democracy, without even getting into the question of social media and hate speech and misinformation and all the other kinds of things that we see going on in terms of the say the destruction of the original ideals of the internet as a space of open democratic communication.
So I have here a question by Yoe Han O, and he asks actually something really interesting. He says, is there any known technical or legal way in which the Russian or Chinese states use something that they use to prevent their in-country traffic or traffic between their countries and other non-Five Eyes countries from being intercepted? So do we know what these countries are doing about?
I don't know a lot about this, but I think it's reasonable to expect that, particularly once the Snowden revelations came out, that a lot of countries, and particularly the countries you've just mentioned, say, wait a minute, this, presumably they were surprised that they then have, it's an arms race. They have a strong incentive to both avoid Five Eyes interception and then also to develop their own global intelligence infrastructure. If they see themselves in a kind of global competition, hegemonic competition, which there's clearly in other areas they do. So there are plenty of things that they could do to avoid this, the Five Eyes. Famously in China, and it's not just about the Five Eyes, but also for access to public information. I mean, there's the so-called Great Wall of China. China has asserted something that they refer to as cyber sovereignty. I actually share some sympathy for that, although I take a rather different view on its ultimate picture. But they want to keep internet traffic within the country itself and to reduce the traffic that goes outside. I think there's something in.
Is that possible? I mean, if given the example that you gave about, the San Francisco Art Institute, if I want to look at their site, don't I necessarily have to go through?
Well, if you want to look at a site that's in another country, then yes, you have to go through all those routers. Perhaps the principal reaction to Snowden revelations is the greatly accelerated use of encryption, such as SSL. So if you see a URL that has HTTPS at the end instead of just HTTP, that means that they're using SSL encryption so that the traffic between you and that website is encrypted, and that makes it, substantially harder to intercept, or to well, it's not harder to intercept, it's harder to decode, put it that way. So that's one thing that they do, and that's possible. And certainly these the large platforms like Google and Yahoo, which found that the NSA was actually intercepting traffic between their own data centers because it wasn't encrypted. I mean, they were horrified, is my understanding, understandably, and so they begin encrypting that. So that's a form of protection. Unfortunately, one of the things that the NSA and others in the Five Eyes have done, and Canada's contributed to this, is the weakening of encryption standards so that it's easier to decrypt. And then, as I mentioned briefly, they work on getting their sort of spyware onto your devices or onto the routers before it gets encrypted so they can look at it in plain text. So I don't think that's fully answered that question, but yeah.
We have two questions, the last ones. The first one is from José Magalhães, and he asks, he says that the present era could be called not the internet era, but rather the splinternet era. And he mentions, that the war in the Ukraine is probably a game changer. Do you think that will have some impact on how we perceive this new age?
Yes, I mean this certainly, the idea of the internet going from being this sort of global borderless infrastructure to being divided up, splintered, as is referred to in the splinter net. Certainly that is a concern to many. I don't think we've got that far yet, although I recognize that the internet is already actually divided up according to these carriers who don't all play nicely with each other, even under normal circumstances. I think the hostilities between particularly the US and sort of the West more generally, and Russia and China are contributing to a breaking up of internet communication along, let's say, called big power lines of power blocks. And the idea of keeping one's national traffic local, which is something that I in particular ways advocate, can contribute to that. But I don't think it necessarily has to. And what I would argue for is that a kind of a cosmopolitan, I don't know if this is quite the right term, but it's the one I've sort of come up with, is cosmopolitan localization. And what I mean by that is, of course, people should be able to communicate with others in other countries. But if the data doesn't have to go to another country, where it's exposed particularly to greater interception risk, then I would say keep it local, either to the country or to the jurisdiction in which it has equal protection under law. And Europe is a good example of that. So if Canada, just in my own case, if Canada, it's in the process of updating its privacy laws, if Canada can maintain comparability with Europe, the GDPR, then I would have much less trouble with Canadian traffic going via the EU or that of accessing websites in the European Union than I do with having our data go via the United States, where we don't have any legal rights. Either is where the data is hosted, which is many cases in Canadian websites, and also this boomerang routing. So I would say that we need to build, from a national point of view, we need to build more connections that go directly between countries that avoid US routing. And Brazil did this in building a fiber. This is when Dilma Rousseff was president of Brazil, built a fiber from Brazil across the Atlantic to, I'm not sure whether it was Portugal or Spain. I think it was a Spanish internet company that was involved in that. And that was to get around that the picture that I showed earlier about how the US is essential. The fiber capacity across the Atlantic between South America and Europe was really small, and now that has been increased for the reasons of avoiding U.S. transit, or by Miami in particular, where the NSA intercepts that. So I'm for doing that. More generally, Canada does not have any fiber across the Pacific. It all goes through the United States. I think Canada should have, direct communications, more direct communications.
But then,
So,
Andrew,
yeah.
You didn't talk about Prism, but then most of us would use Google and Google services, etc. So
Yes, so do I.
I have a final question from João Ribeiro. He's one of my students, and he's asking, and this is a really interesting question for me. Is there a way to mitigate the number of IP reroutes that, when you're communicating? Is there some way that you yourself can attempt to mitigate the number of IP reroutes that your messages go through? Or at least find ways to send them through specific locations that are safety certified.
Yes, there are a variety of ways of doing that. One is, who is your service provider? Mm-hmm. So I showed the two different routes that go into the university, the Autonomous University of Madrid. One went via UK, one went directly from Portugal to Spain. That's because of the policies of the service providers. So check those out and see which ones actually want to try to, avoid those kinds of routing. So that's a sort of a consumer choice thing if it's available to you. Another thing that is a big measure being promoted in Canada by the Canadian Internet Registration Authority is what are called internet exchange points, or public internet exchange points. So within a particular region, all of or as many as possible of the networks connect at the same place. And in Toronto, that's at that building 151 Front Street, there's a Toronto Internet Exchange Point. And that boomerang routing that I showed would be addressed. And I think it probably has been by now. I took that route from, it was now a long time ago, or a decade or so ago. By connecting locally, so that you don't need to go through these transit providers. And those are run as cooperatives, they're nonprofit, they're very efficient, they have economic returns very quickly, according to calculations, just that they are not in the interests of the big telecom providers. So because they avoid transit fees, and so somebody doesn't get paid when you just exchange locally. So that's a big one, and that's a policy that's being pursued in various places. Africa particularly, there are people there who are promoting that. So that might be something that would work more in Portugal, Spain, and so on.
Okay, Well, it is now 8 p.m., which brings us to a close, but not before I say thank you so much, Andrew. This has, as most of the talks that we've heard, if not all, been both incredibly interesting and fascinating and disheartening. It seems like this is a world that is just incredibly complex, where we have little power, you know, to address the ways in which our data circulates, who sees it, etc., etc. I want to thank you so very much for giving this talk. I want to thank everyone for being here today. April 13th, we'll have Natasha Dalshaw, but Andrew, thank you so very much in my name and in the name of all of us. Thanks for coming. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I don't want to leave you discouraged and disheartened. There are big challenges, but there's always been big challenges, and this is one that I hope I've provided a little bit of insight into that may encourage you to, you know, think, you know, more about where your data goes and how it might be different and what kind of internet and you want. So thank you and good luck.
I'd say to my Portuguese colleagues here and friends, and that perhaps we should all use the IFS Maps just to provide the project with some data, but also for us to see what's going on, because I honestly don't know. I'll check it afterwards.
Yeah, well, I would appreciate that and really encourage you to do that. Be aware that the particularly the accuracy of some of the locations is not as good as I would want. So you should treat that with a grain of salt, but the general patterns will be helpful to you, and do get in touch if you have problems or you'd like some more information.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.